Hello! Today I would like to emphasize the importance in my teaching about style. What is style? What is good taste? Is it authenticity? Not always. In the score, in the edition, in the facsimile of some original, the source, which is true. It's tempting. But I also think is the instrument. And sometimes the translation brings more to the truth than the original language. In any case, it's a universal message. But the point is, how do we define, now that we can revisit so many time periods of music styles, genres, than ever before they could for their own past? It's mesmerizing. We can have the approach from the original instrument, the approach of the as authentic as possibly definable score source material, obviously. Perhaps combine both, and then ostracize those who play on the wrong instrument with the wrong edition in the eyes of the wrong people. Oh, purists are everywhere, and they're marvelous because they develop and open niches beyond belief. Not everybody can be a generalist, and not everybody can embrace all the history of culture of music for centuries that goes from context, history, evolution of technology, of course science, not to mention of societies, and then identifications to different musical time periods for their own folkloric input, the oral tradition of music, not only the savant written one, but also the intuitive one, the sung one, the lullabies, the wedding dances, the traditional marching or perhaps parading or processionals. And of course we go into religions and into connection of music as a vehicle for an elevation of spiritual uplifting, as well as for separately for some daily events, just to in fact be an escapism for the soul, for the mind, for the thought. Travel in your own imagination, daydream. So in a way, all the past, no matter how many layers of that past are, which century we are playing or reading or hearing or imagining how to play, if we replay them and we revisit them with our own sensitivity, our own subjectivity, obviously, and something like our own developed, acquired taste, it comes from the people who do research, but then not everybody's encyclopedian in their way of playing. They like to think perhaps like a recital is a bouquet of roses of different kind or different flowers within all, not only roses. And so we play on the modern piano inevitably different styles, genres, and inevitably by playing them on the same instrument, we blend them. Perhaps we take away from the tuning aspect of the instrument that created the colorization of the harmonies that cannot be done with a certain type of tuning that is more universal, like the well-tempered. But then also the length of sound, the resonance, the expectation of the phrase. How do we pace the music? What is allegro in 18th, 17th, 16th century compared to 19th, 20th century? Obviously things tend to be faster, more driven, perhaps less longing, like in the romantic 19th century era, or less organized as in the early 19th and late 18th century in classical music, from Baroque to classic. All these things can be said, and they are truth. So, in plural, not in singular. I try to find answers for my students to contextualize their question and their quest, rather than giving them, I like that tempo and that's better because that's how I like it. That is true for myself as a performer, as an artist, as a humble servant to the muse, as we all need to be honest in front of the mirror of our playing and think, am I really reaching the phrase of the narrative point of the story? Am I really saying it the most... am I expressing myself with the rhetoric that represents this time period? Am I ornamenting, decorating, expressing, perhaps rubating? Oh, doesn't exist as a verb, but taking the time to space the notes, to add some thoughtfulness between the notes that is not indicated in the rhythmic notation. After all, often the notation of a composer's intent inevitably is reductive, because the notation isn't that detailed. And if it were to be that detailed, then it would be, in a way, locking away the option for interpretation, for one's own, let's say, appropriation of the piece as a performer, even if we come centuries later after the writing of the piece, and perhaps decades after establishments of recordings that are authority of the same repertoire. But then what's the point? We have there to revisit it, to marvel, to discover, to try to understand, not by ignoring what the others have done, nor by pretending that we invent it all from scratch, but to a certain extent there is a recomposition of the performance of the piece during a performance by an interpreter. Not that he or she becomes a composer per se, but the storyteller of the moment, so that the music of the past is in fact extemporal while being presented temporally to an audience. Of course, the audience by essence is blind, meaning, my analogies are sometimes cruel, forgive me. I mean, they don't have a score to follow. In fact, they don't know perhaps how to read the music. That's up to the cooking knowledge of the musicians. And the music lovers can read music, they even can be, and sometimes, very often, are very, very subtle musicians themselves. But the industry of playing, the decades it takes to create this muscular memory system, to develop the capacity to control a touch with various overlapping layers and complexities, orchestral innuendos on the piano versus perhaps voice or dance imitation for the style of the piece. In other words, it's subtle and complex and takes time. So perhaps not, and it shouldn't be the case forever, but there is not on one side the ones who know, then the ones who listen, and in the middle the ones who think, through the publishing, editing, through the scholars for the recordings and so on. So we should be, in fact, reaching an osmosis where music is made alive, regardless of its time period, not ignored, because mezzo forte in Schubert cannot be the same as in, let's say, Ravel, because the texture, the context, the resonance, the instrument, the acoustics, the other pieces composed by the composers that we play become some kind of a guideline, like how did Beethoven write his symphonies to understand what a piano sonata is, or his string quartets, Mozart his operas, regardless if we play on fortepiano, harpsichord or piano, his works for keyboard, to call it clavier, of course, as it should be. And not to mention Bach and the organ and the polyphony and all the composers around them who are today lesser known, fairly, unfairly, regardless. But the point is that there's so many. I don't want to make a catalog here. And I can't, because I'll forget. But the point is that meaningful music, beautiful music, at least to our standards, and everybody's seeing in his or her own way what beauty is in the eye of the beholder, in the ear of the beholder. So therefore, all this to say that when the audience is captive rather than blind, that's a better analogy, we as performers have the responsibility to display the discourse, the thought process, the emotional state, the hints of perhaps humorous or out of context, perhaps today less obvious audacities, dissonances that were perhaps revolutionary for their time, or mixtures of major and minor, a dose of modality within tonality, which then brings us to atonality, possibly post-atonality, microtonality, and perhaps a return to tonality, because somehow there is a cycle, I was going to say both in the same word, a circle, which in a way reflects our yearnings. We are humans with brains without which we cannot think, articulate, express, language by essence, mother tongue, acquired language, information, technology knowledge, but also cultural knowledge of large culture. You read books, you watch theater plays, you understand how people thought about the finitude, about how they thought in an enlightened way or in a fearing way, the God in the plural or in the singular, and how this eternal quest of the short span of life on earth of some people left such traces inside us that really became an incredible heritage from which sometimes we have difficulty to extract ourselves from, because we are given this tradition and there's this chapel that believes against this other chapel's belief, and they're wrong, our God is right and yours not, and therefore the aesthetics of this and the aesthetics of that. And of course, in the course of all these ever evolving live music making, there is some kind of a spiritual quest, at least some kind of uplifting, regardless if it's mystical or religious or humanistic, in the sense of embracing the greater good and trying to leave that trace after oneself that brings the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity, like Beethoven's Ninth Symphonies with Schiller's text, and Mozart's Magic Flute, Wagner's operas. All these are strong, even way beyond only the technically music part section of what an opera and a film, a serial, any form of imagination, as far as Scriabin's mystical views of the music as the sort of vehicle between the eternal and us. And the answers cannot be as complex when it comes down to transmitting a skill, how to play legato, non-legato, staccato. And so to be believable, you have to be convinced. First, the teacher has to be convincing, not just because I like it, but perhaps this is the meter, this is the tradition, this is how the other pieces of the composer are played when they play with, let's say, Schumann wrote a string and piano piece, then we can see about the phrasing more clearly because of the bowing and imitate it on the piano. The piano morphs into a string instrument, morphs into a song or aria, morphs into a symphony orchestra, morphs into a two-voice invention by Bach, the intervals, the dissonances, the melodies or the melodic tunes, or possibly only the motifs, and ultimately in fugues, all kinds of elucubrations of the brain that are so intensely cerebral, but then with heart, with soul. And we hear these fugues and this superimposed layered complexity of voices, either sang, like in the Romantic era, of course, inherited from the Renaissance. And we have all these incredible voice leadings. And so when you are nourished as a musician by all this musical bath of the predecessors, I think you bring out in a single note that you'll play all your life of experience, filtering, appropriating, understanding, and then sending to the audience on the live moment all the meaning in one note, all the life in through one note. the life of experience, the life of acquired experience, of course, as well as intuitive continuing development, because somehow at the beginning there is the intuition, call it talent or perhaps calling or anything, but something that you cannot define only by the know-how which you acquire in order to be able to perform technically. You cannot be artistic if you don't have technique. It's like you cannot express yourself in a given language, and that my poor English vocabulary is the proof of. Unfortunately, that's another analogy and self-deprecation. But it is a universal language, so I use it to express oneself subtly. So therefore, to express oneself artistic views, acquired or intuitive, combining both, or however knowledgeable or however intuitive only, they not need to go through the notes and the playing. So in a way, the alphabet is the combination of sounds and pulse, rhythm and harmony. That means dissonant or atonal, and regardless, it's just an enmarvelment of the moment, and you go, oh. And you might say, I don't get it. Or you might say, as a listener, it's confusing. Or why is it so long? Or I don't get it. Somehow the GPS format doesn't give me the explanation like in a classical work, where I feel more clearly where I am navigating as a listener, at least where the the performer is guiding me towards. And then sometimes you hear pieces that you know because you played, or perhaps you heard very often and you love them. Somebody plays them and you go, I don't like that interpretation. In other words, especially in professional systems where we have teachers who are then jury members of competitions, because that's so unnatural for art to compare and hierarchize, sportively speaking, in orders of subjective opinions, inevitably, therefore nothing objective correctly so much than that, but that's another story. But let's say in juries, competitors play in front of judges who know the pieces or who have experienced the pieces. Therefore, they would immediately reject by saying, it's not the way it's supposed to be. And many professionals consider that there is one way, which is, of course, theirs. And then others, and I am among them, who accept the alterity. I accept to be surprised. I accept to be convinced by something I wouldn't do. If the tempo is too slow for my taste, but it brings to some other dimension of the texture, of the meaning, or at least the way of the conviction of the performer, I can say, perhaps you're wrong to think it like that. Regardless of tradition, the score, the book, and all kinds of analytical thought processes, there is the pure moment of how you feel about it, how you hear it innerly, how you hear it, how you read what you heard, and your ear has to reproduce most purely, directly, what you inhaled by the reading, and how it goes out through your playing, through your ear, as a filter that is a musical, expressive, sensitive membrane. And the ideal interpretation is the one that you don't notice as a listener, because you reach as a performer a sense of temporary, and I mentioned that as such, truth, or at least believable moment where, while we know it's a storytelling, it's a narrative storytelling, just like in theater, make believe, enter in the character, inhabit character which you're not, and they know you're not, and you know you're not, but during the process of the theater play, you become it, the character. You believe, you suffer, you breathe, you think, you morph into the character that you play to be believable, regardless then of how you do that. and to some you will be overplaying, to some others you'll be under playing in terms of the emotional charge that you put into it. And comes all this complete difficulty for students to decipher what is the intent of the composer when we have in it already do have quite a century almost plus actually of recordings, not great quality in terms of sound or authenticity of their playing, but still we have Scriabin playing and Rachmaninoff playing. Though we play their music, we don't play their playing. We hear their playing as if this is going to give us the answer to the authenticity, since we miss knowing how Beethoven wanted it played or how he played it, because of course we don't have direct sound connection to be able to go and hear how he played, how Mozart improvised his cadenzas, how Bach improvised his choral preludes in church before the beginning of the service. Okay, we imagine, we have the written scores, we learn, and we have scholars who develop complete unfinished music of these composers, or even can write music in the given style because they develop such kinship with the musical language. It's a question of intelligent attuning to it. You get tuned to a certain style, character, and genre, and then of course an Elizabethan theater actor doesn't obviously play in a Disney movie, but perhaps that also is the good aspect of acting, is that you have to be believable in different things. And when a pianist plays a recital and they play Scarlatti, Bach, Mozart, Chopin, Schumann, Schubert, and then perhaps Prokofiev, Ligeti, and so on, in the same recital, it's a bouquet, but on the same instrument within. That's what was the initial purpose of my conversation, well, one-sided unfortunately with the camera, let's say monologue then, with you today about the choice of how to stylistically shape, sculpt the texture and the meaning and the very, I would say, experience of the piece as a structure, as a construction. When you have a longer movement or group of movements, and you have the architect, the mason, as well as the designer or the interior decorator, because it depends how you phrase and how you finger to obtain that phrase. If you want it to be by 2, by 4, by 6, if you want it to be more short and long, or more breathless, or more long sentence, run-on sentence saying, according to the resonance of the instrument, the pedal, the capacity. Of course, acoustics, that are the last thing that any performer is in charge of, since the architect is not the performer. But let's say that all performers have an inner imagination of the soundscape they want to create in the reality of what comes out with their industry of playing, and then therefore connecting with the audience, which, not having the score, is in a way fed the musical meaning of all what we do. Regardless if they know the piece, if they disagree with the way we hear the piece as performers, or if, in the best case scenario, in my opinion, the most liberating one, at least the one we fear the least to disappoint ourselves or the other professionals who know the piece, is when the listener is a good willing person who doesn't know the piece, but is willing and there, either because they know you or they know somebody else, and whichever social reason for which they gather to listen, or perhaps they just stay at home and listen to a recording. But there is an encounter that they do to come to what you play for them at whichever moment, live or recorded. But in live it's more meaningful, I think, because at that time you have different people perceiving the music at different levels, but together. And there's a sense of communal experience of the piece. Regardless if it's misunderstood, more understood, differently understood, which aspects of the piece prevail in the observing, listening quality of the listener. Of course, ideally, you should go and spell it note by note, and then organize it voice by voice, and then put it all together so that the listener can then taste all the combinations of the sounds, which in a way, by combining, could confuse because you don't know which one to follow. And you listen to it more or less just like vertical slices of chords or music. In other words, you train your listening as well as you train your playing as a performer in order to translate the most directly possible the intent of the composer. But the listener is also in a situation where, just like the conductor, they don't play the instrument, but they live the music through the pulse, but they indicate, but still they don't touch the music making, they don't touch the sound. In the same way, the listener doesn't play. So it's a sort of a not passive actor of the performance, but an avid, active actor who gets involved in the psychological build-up, emotional driven excitement, or whichever human nature is expressed through the pieces of the different composers you play, through their own inner worlds. And you start becoming more acquainted as a listener to some and say, I don't like that, but I love this. And Scriabin, oh my God, I don't get it. But, oh, Rachmaninoff this. But yeah, but he was not as modern as Stravinsky, because Stravinsky really was a modernist and always tried new styles, genres, and others say, but he wasn't as, let's say, sincere, because he gave up everything that he believed in to write something different. And so some others remain the same through their life artistically. Gershwin, Rachmaninoff, regardless of the changing times and what in music was, or in art. And therefore, because of art, you get into atonalism and all these equivalents of visual arts, disregarding the descriptiveness of the art or the photographic precision of the art, but just the psychological expression of a mood. And so the Impressionism and then the Cubism and all the isms. So all this exponentially expands our horizons of perception. Perhaps we are unable to perceive something to which we're not attuned. So we have to study and work towards it. It's a French expression, l'appétit vient en mangeant, which means, translated in English would be, you gather more appetite while you keep eating, because in a way, the more you eat, the more you're able to exercise your taste buds. And then you say, oh, I can feel that bittersweet taste of this, or the volume of this compared to the proportion of that. A sauce to be made by a cook from another cook, or a person who knows which ingredients will prevail in the final taste when you put it in your mouth. And of course, all taste buds are not the same, all ears are not the same, all eyes don't perceive the same way, exercised or not, intuitive or very educated and cultivated, because people can be more curious for certain things to cultivate themselves than others. Would it be industry? Would it be engineering? Or would it be art knowledge or history, or perhaps archaeology? And somehow combine it with today's meaning and understanding, and somehow bringing to the humans who you're with during your lifetime, in terms of co-living on this planet, in that sense, contemporaries in the literal sense of the word, you bring to each other the best of your experience, the earnest of your experience, the honest of your essence, of what you tried to, regardless if you succeeded or not, perceive, understand, translate, or perhaps retranslate, so that you can think that perhaps people will understand it better through your translation than somebody else's translation. Again, not like in a competition where you say, I'm number one, he's number two. I find that totally wrong. But society calls for competition in every domain, so they extended it to art. But in fact, there is room for all. not unfortunately so for the living capacity from it, because most of the artists are poor and don't have success or recognition. And the word recognition is a very complex word, because it implements some kind of financial evaluation of the quality of what you produce or reproduce if you don't compose it in music, or how you reproduce it by giving it a new attractiveness to a given generation or a given gender, or we don't do it willingly per se, so detailedly, or perhaps sometimes it's just artificially sort of, well, let's say, marketed towards a certain clientele. But these are like very superficial things, and it's all very it's not vile per se, because I would not like to appear like I'm judgmental, since I'm tolerant and I accept that there are different ways to touch people and reach people with a certain complexity of things, whether it be science, of art, or others. But we cannot not have our own personal taste of accepting or not certain genuine serving of the muse in some a little more marketed ways, which nothing wrong with it, obviously, because music is also part of entertainment if it's within, let's say, or not actually combined to a film or a video game, and then it becomes a, functional music, which is necessary too. And we can consider that art industry is also entertainment in the general sense of escapism. Tell me a story, let me believe and stop disbelieving that you're just telling me the story because I want to live the life of this or the yearnings of that, and to have an epic story that I won't have in my life because, I don't know, I'm in a different time period than the ones that I seem to be in my daydreams more liking to be in. This is nostalgia or some kind of science fiction. Whichever time period, we like to think elsewhere than where we are. Perhaps it's healthy in a way, it's a yearning. Sometimes it becomes painful if it's a rejection of the present per se. And I don't think that anybody has the right tool to evaluate how much of what we should do to blend all these. What is the right mix of nostalgia, hope, and todayness? I don't know. Actually, enthusiasm is one thing, rigorousness is another thing, and my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, managed to blend both so well, so rightly, so inspiringly, and so believably, and so sometimes cruelly, but without cruelty, in the sense that it was a she reads in your capacity of what you will do or become, or you should rather strive towards that. She doesn't impose, of course, but if you go to consult, it's not just if I'm playing fast or slow, with pedal or less pedal. These are very important things to settle at the get-go. But the higher levels, the conception, the understanding, the culture, the whole absorption of the experience of humanity before you into what you do, would it be your personal sculpture or your personal writing, even if you use the other people's words, but you organize them in a way that the vehicle not only a thought but also an emotional, you receive words like arrows psychologically, or you can cuddle, or term of endearment, or bittersweet, or sweet bitter, as in French is in the other order, doux amer. Regardless, before even getting lost in translation, already getting to connect to the essence towards which we all yearn. Is it willingly or in perhaps subconsciously? Not all of us are called to do these things daily, because, as I said, economically we all know that they're not rewarding compared to exact sciences, which are necessary to heal people, to feed people, to basically organize a balanced psychological, let's say, flourishment, I would say, blossoming of the personalities of each human on earth. I mean, obviously these words sound completely cheesy because so generalistic and apparently naive, to say the least, when we talk of world peace and no more world hunger. But then if we become only cynical about it because we can do nothing about it, then everybody can do nothing about it, nobody does anything about it. So I think at our humble levels, we contribute to do something that can be meaningfully inspirational and helpful towards the blossoming of their personality. Would it be an ingredient of their own lives? But that would be already without pretentiousness or any idea of arrogance. Very humbly, I think it's a beautiful goal. Some feed the soul, some feed the bodies, and we need to be healthy to be able to experience life. And if we are not, we have to struggle and to be helped and to be understood and to be nurtured, as we need to nurture also those who are not. I mean, in other words, we have to be compassionate. And in a way, all these composers who, for instance, in the past lived in terrible conditions, most of them because poverty, lack of everything, electricity, transport, health, let's say vaccinations, all kinds of ways to maintain the body alive as much as possible without psychological drops and downs or accidents, and then of course fate of situations like war and all these, for which the individual is hardly able to do anything about it on the grand scheme of things. Then the powers that are in play are way beyond and above all of us, individually at least. But we produce something that is meaningful to somebody. Perhaps not now, but hopefully yes. And that helps to receive the feedback. And sometimes it's a clash, and sometimes it's a disagreement, and many times it's a I don't like it, or I hate it, or he's not right, or she's not supposed to do that. And yes, but when you teach, you're supposed to bring to a student a sense of universal understanding, and also carve their capacity by self-criticism and by being very disciplined and thorough in their approach technically towards what they need to reach or to achieve when they're embarked in a given domain. From whichever domain it is fulfill yourself while serving the purpose, and therefore by doing so humbly, you are serving those who will be inspired by you for themselves to do something else, and that will bring something else to humanity. So you can play a great piece to somebody who might think about how to invent a new medicine while listening to it. Marvelous. It doesn't mean that it's directly that, but somehow we bathe in a culture or in an entertainment industry or in a cultural knowledge, museal or real. I don't think that performing a piece in concert with or for a student or through a student is a museum piece that is presented as an artifact. It's like, hey, this is the symphony of this dead composer, or this is the sonata of this, etc. No, I think the performers are not the best composers. The composers aren't the best performers for their music, as a matter of fact. But the point is that the substance of the music itself, what it brings to us is a nourishment of our souls, a nourishment of our hopes, a nourishment of our, or a solace, or a important portion of music is also the solace it gives us, regardless if we acknowledge it or not. It's kind of consolation that things will be fine after this or that loss of a loved one, or something that was unfair in your life. and you search for a meaning to it and you don't find it, and sometimes you do for some in religion, and that's fine if it helps them through this, and others in music, others in poetry, others in writing, in painting, and others in substances, or in others in any kind of other escapisms, healthy or not. Well, difficult to define them all, but of course some are healthier than others. It's not about moralizing, not about sanitizing the society. It's about contributing through the beauty, the meaning, the truth, what you consider to be the truth by your earnest search. Not that you want to impose it over the others if they believe in another one, but you bring your groove, and you leave these traces in their souls, and they do with it something, or they don't do anything with it, but somehow it's part of what we receive. We watched this, we read this, we heard that, a joke, a prayer, a meaningful, I don't know, storytelling through a format of any audiovisual device today, or in live or person, or we were just touched by somebody telling us something that hurt us, or perhaps revolted us, or perhaps made us think about it and think, I'll think again about it differently. That's exactly what interpretation is about. I rethink actually myself the interpretation when I teach a student the style of this and that on the piano, saying, of course, the ornaments, the betterment, what they used to call the embellishments in the Baroque, would be more of a melodic, thematic material that is embedded in the texture in the Romantic era, and not separated or just added as a spice or as a taste. Yes, I try to communicate my beliefs through words, even if they are poor in their vocabulary, compared to the music that by its essence doesn't need words, since it expresses itself. Of course, I don't speak of music with lyrics for that purpose, but music without lyrics, it still talks through its own emotional or psychological driven charge that powerfully compels us. Differently, less, more or less, but communally, individually, together we experience differently what it brings to us, and we agree to have shared it. The time of the random group of people who gather in a given concert hall to hear a given pianist play a given piece. Gathering there for whichever reasons in the first place, but then getting out of the experience something that they can think about later, because in a way classical music has this incredible quality, is that it talks to our thought process, and it makes us reflect, it makes us think, it makes us rethink. It's not about just philosophy per se, but beyond the entertaining value of it, which is also partially the case with all this virtuosity and this effect and the presence of the artist on stage. So in a way it could be a distraction from the music, because in part it is, by bringing it through the filter of your personality as an artist performer. But then something is left that is the substance of the piece, and that is very important, that is beyond the composer and the performer, is what is created on the spot, this ephemeral moment that is unbelievably unforgettable, like some incredibly unforgettable fragrance of a plant or of a person that you've known and you love and you miss. It touches you at such many different levels of consciousness and subconsciousness that you do something with it, because it calls you to think. It calls you to reflect upon the essence of things. It doesn't just only entertain you for the sake of it, but it does too. And regardless if it's only distracting, then it's good too. I have nothing, and I'm not in any place, in any way, considering that classical music is more important than other music. I just say that classical music tends to bring us to think about who we are in ourselves. It's a meditational vehicle in a way, that does it without to call itself that. It just serves several purposes. It can entertain and move, excite our curiosity in the sense of we need to know, we want to understand, we want to know more, we want to understand better what we love and why we love it. Why does it mean to me so much, this or that? And then the more you learn, like the appetite comes by consuming, then the more you understand and the more you like. And if you dislike, then you turn and leave it and start getting infatuated in something else, in terms of the aesthetic, the meaning, whatever it brings to your life. I think to a certain extent is like relationships. You give your sincere earnest and you're afraid it's going to be, let's say, mistreated or perhaps betrayed. And so you're afraid to open yourself, and you sometimes do the same with music. You say, oh, this music is not for me, or oh, I don't like to play that music, or I don't understand this, or it's not for me. And then through a performer or a teacher or a musicologist, or perhaps just a serendipitous situation where the music is used, perhaps even in a commercial for something on TV, all of a sudden you have a key to enter through that lock and discover, there's incredible things I ignored. I didn't even know were there, and now become so meaningful to me. I cannot live the rest of my life without them. A painting, a sculpture, a film, and movie directors' artworks, and you go like, oh my God, I want to see all the films of this guy because he developed something that means to me about what I think is the meaning of life. Of course, we don't always put it all in philosophical terms because it would be very heavy to carry every day, unless we are philosophers, which technically we are without to know. But the point is that when we're aware of it, then is the jargon, the knowledge, the reading, the books, and then we start thinking through this point of view or that point of view, and we confront them or compare them, and then we become knowledgeable. I don't speak of that level of philosophy, which is amazing for those who are erudites, true erudites. I think music is not that erudite. Well, of course, to play a fugue, to write a fugue, demands erudition. But I must say that to write an unbelievably unforgettable melody might not. It calls for some kind of intonation or unison with the inspiration that comes to you. I don't know if you dig it from your own past. Perhaps most of it is like a reminiscence to the creator rather than manufactured novelty, which, by the way, sometimes is more artificial, because even if you have the know-how, if you know the trade of yours very well, it doesn't mean that you touch the soul essence that makes that you believe it. And I find that very often the case with interpretation. You can say, oh, this guy or this woman plays it faster and brilliant and clean, and my God, I'll never be able to play it like this. What is my level? If you compare yourself, or if you're performing that, you could say the same if you're skating and you watch a skater on TV in the Olympics. Whatever, you compare in a way. Am I as beautiful? Am I as intelligent? Am I dumb? Am I smart? How can I become more this? How can I become all that? How can I lose weight? I mean, we all, in our daily lives, search to better ourselves through education, through emulation, through communication, through being with the other, or exchanging with the other. It doesn't have to be to exchange, but or the other being in another time period, and we dialogue with the composer's thoughts, even if we don't really dialogue with the composer in real time. If the composer is dead, 99% of the cases of what I teach is the meaning of the intense of the dead composers for the young life students, who in turn will build from that and the other experiences that they will gather through their life, learning and performing, and then in turn transmit it themselves to their students. And then that chain will create a sense of what we call tradition, or like, how do we play piano Russian style? Tradition for the technique is different from the French. The pearled playing or the magnetic connection to the keys. Okay, we then become parts of a thought, a school of thought, and a school of performance, and a school of believing, and then we become perhaps a little less open-minded because we are convinced, and that's not wrong. I think conviction is not the opposite of tolerance. I think conviction is more like something you agree to disagree with others, and at the same time something you're able through lifetimes situations to evolve within. So it is, in fact, all learning is experiencing of being alive. From the mother tongue as a baby to the learned, acquired languages as an adult, opening to horizons that you wouldn't if you're not allowed to travel, if you're not allowed to read, to know. How do you understand a certain literature without knowing the language in which it was written? It's impossible to go through learning the languages of each author you want to learn, because then you won't have enough time. And so you end up by learning a lot about, or reading a lot in a translation. And hopefully, and most of the time, the translation brings you mostly close to the meaning of the storytelling than all the quoting or the innuendos and the hints and the humor and the tenderness and perhaps the bittersweetness of it. All these subtle levels, which only come when you reach the piece in its original intent, because after all, the given creator lives, she, in their own time period with their own as well geographic location, which also is part of their intellectual vision of the world of their time, obviously. And so you cannot say that Schumann's music is not related to German literature, because it is. Not only the music with lyrics, I speak about the non-lyrics music. It's very German, and Fauré is very French. But how do you define what is French in Fauré compared to what is German in Schumann? And what if Fauré was German and Schumann was French? How would it be? Would you have the syntax of the verb at the end of the words of the phrase in German create syncopations like in the harmonic dislocations of Schumann? Or is that only that? Or is it just an ingredient towards that? Does he translate, in fact, through music, his intellect, which is German, and he thinks through German? Does it mean that his music is not universal? No, it's universal because he's the German romantic. And Fauré is universal because he's a French neoclassic for some, etc. You can define it differently, and you can disagree with my definition, but it brings you to think. And I think the interpretation, the choosing the style of the performance of a given piece on an instrument that perhaps is not corresponding or was not intended for, in an art industrial form of projection which was not intended to either, with digital microphones that capture every detail compared to how the piece was heard in the 18th century with people walking around a room instead of a classroom or a concert hall or a recording studio or a video and all that. In other words, between the essence of the piece and what we think the essence of the piece is, it differs if you're a concert pianist of 1930, a concert pianist of 1960, a concert pianist of 1990. You know more about editions, you know more about musicologist researches, you know more about authentic music on authentic instruments, performance practices. You cannot ignore it. I mean, you can choose to ignore it, but you don't have to ignore it. You don't have to embrace it either. You have to just navigate through it with subtle intelligence, with cultivated culture that brings your curiosity to feed your anxiety or your fear of not doing right, as if there is a wrong, but you define it at some point. And I think, yes, we reach performances that at some point of our lives reach what we were aiming towards from learning the piece in the first place, while playing it at many occasions, writing it, recording it, publishing it, possibly writing articles about it. In other words, whichever way the music lives with us through life, it evolves with ourselves and our understanding of the world, or our prior misunderstanding of the world. If we question ourselves and we say, oh, when I was young I didn't understand half of it, now I do. Fine, then you give the audience or the students the fruit of your experience on earth. And I think that that's the beauty of teaching, is this kind of selflessness, this idea that you give to the other not who you are, but you bring them to become who they are. You don't give them the key to how you play. You give them the capacity to build a lock to unlock the ways they will play. In other words, it's not just about cloning and play like I like, or you're wrong if you don't like it the way I like it, because I came before you and I met the piece before you, and therefore the tradition and my knowledge and my age oblige you to accept it. Less and more than more nowadays, because of the availability of different interpretations. Students are no more captive to a student-teacher rapport about the truth of the piece when they learn it in the first place before they question it in order to develop their own understanding. This is what I think today is more about comparing, because they have the ability to hear immediately how Scriabin played his piece, how Sofronitsky, his son-in-law, played the piece, and how, I don't know, Igor Zhukov played the piece, and then you play a piece, and all of a sudden you say, I don't like the way they did it. Of course, it sounds very easy to say and always arrogant sounding like, because you have to respect that all these other people who played the piece that you're trying to play, they went through all this path of how will I finger it, how will I pedal it, how will I express it, which tempo, how much of this, how much of that, what is right, what is appropriate, what is not. And of course, the fact that you can access the different ways of hearing the same piece before you chronologically arrive on earth to do it on your own, you cannot ignore them, and you don't want to let them overwhelm you either, because then you'll be just imitating them. Even if it's tempting for some, if you admire them. It's a slow process where the music enters in you and it becomes you, it becomes organic. You don't just play because it says so on the score, even if the score is the closest to the original that we've ever had in compared to, let's say, earlier generations. But you express yourself because you have a conviction to express it like that. Not only because it says it there, or because it says it there, it developed a conviction in you about how to make that be it. And if you don't like it, then write your own piece. But if you play the piece of the composer, you have to morph into what you think the composer wanted. And thankfully, not everybody agrees, because thankfully everybody doesn't play the same way. And therefore, instead of rejecting, we can say, perhaps I disagree, but it's interesting. Or this aspect, I never thought about it in this tempo. I like that. I do that. And I think that to remain very disciplined as a teacher, to be expecting a lot of the student, is also to respect the student's own yearning into the piece. You can tell the student you're wrong, or you misread, or you misunderstood, or you are misguided by your intuition sometimes, because not all classical music, and far from it, is intuitive. Or only, let's say, what's the word? Analytically clear. Sometimes the composer goes counterintuitive, and if you have a musical intuition, then the tension and the releases, the soft and the the loud, are inverted. You end up questions with an affirmation, or you affirm questions with another type of question. It's incredibly rich in the way of expressing one's inner world in music. And I think you filter through every note your inner world of what you received, and you transform it through the note of the composer. As accurate as you can, you practice and repeat endlessly in order to get that accuracy, in order to reach that truth that you translate. And I find as a teacher, I'm the hyphen between this. The score doesn't sing or play by itself. I can put the score against my ear, it doesn't. So it has to come alive, even wrongly, and then, in my opinion. But then I help the student find what corresponds also to their personality. I don't adapt to their personality the piece, because then I wouldn't be respecting them to teach them the piece as I believe it is. Which is why my students know that I end up by saying, oh, the composer told me. Of course they know that's not the case. But in a way, it's a humorous way to say in short, that's what I believe, or that's how I like it. And then make it yours. Thank you.